Hello, hello. You're listening to Cubitt Community Radio for a special episode of Slippy Discussions. Thanks to everyone who tuned in over the last 6 months for the Slippy Vision music shows on Setvolt Radio. Really appreciate your listenership and your curious ears. This is a nice little full circle moment because Slippy Vision originally started off on Cubitt Community Radio back in 2023. So thanks a lot, Andy, for having us back on. This episode is the first of a 3-part series of interviews exploring the importance of physical music spaces as sites of community building, political activism, and creative experimentation. And I'll be speaking to 3 different guests for each episode. This evening, I'm really happy to be joined by ANJALI, a cultural producer, DJ, writer, and community organizer, whose work and practice has really informed and shaped my understanding and relationship to club culture over the last few years. But instead of me babbling on, and ANJALI, can you share a little bit about kind of how you understand the work and sort of practice that you're doing, the kind of different hats you're wearing at the moment, and any kind of groups or initiatives you're involved in that you're particularly interested in?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. First, I just want to say I'm really excited to be here and thrilled to be here. It's so nice. I enjoyed your music shows a lot, as I was just telling you earlier. I feel like I'm extra excited for this series of 3 as well. I guess things in my practice currently, what I'm doing, I tend to be flitting through lots of different things and lots of different spaces at the same time. But I think at the moment I've really been enjoying writing about nightlife, specifically queer nightlife, on Substack. So basically just like a blog, which has been a really nice space just to, keep exploring things as they come up, as I was saying with you before. But there's definitely a few other things going on. I run a party with friends called Lilith. So we recently had one of our, we had an outdoor day party, which you were at, with jelly wrestling, which was, it was so good. It was so good. I'm really glad that worked. We didn't know if it would. There's always a little bit of risk when you introduce these kinds of things, but it worked very, very well. So I've just been doing different things. But I've been working in and around nightlife for a long time. I used to do the programming at a club, and then much later on in orbiting nightlife spaces, I started DJing. Only many, many years in. That's much more of a recent development. But I've been writing about nightlife, I think, as long as I've been partying. So those two have always kind of been quite close together. I think other things, areas of focus that I've been exploring more recently, both practically and writing again, has been like worker organizing in nightlife, especially as it's been more professionalized, I think, in recent times and in the past 20 years, and also with a lot of current movements around Palestine and a lot of DJs withdrawing their labor from festivals owned by KKR. People are starting to think about the ownership of our spaces, the ownership of our community spaces. I've been looking into that a lot. And also just want to shout out Esme, who recently led a huge boycott of Field Day Festival, along with another crew of Sisu people. So very much have been inspired by a lot of the stuff that's been happening on the ground.
Sick. Thanks so much. You touched on like a lot of stuff I would like to speak in a bit more detail about throughout the show. I wanted to ask, can you kind of talk about any sort of particular kind of early formative experiences of raving or dancing? Maybe not necessarily in like a clubbing space, but kind of any kind of formative experiences that you had as a partier or a participant, and kind of what hooked you in, I suppose.
Yeah, I love this question. Any opportunity to like reach back into the mind, reach back into the body, try and remember. So I actually started like partying and going out quite late. Definitely, like I would say well into my 20s. I didn't really go out as a teenager at all. I was very like quiet and quite introverted, so very much partying has been something in my adult life, whereas a lot of people I know, they're like, oh, I've been raving since I was like 14 years old. That definitely was not me. I did not like loud spaces. I did not like partying at all. So it was quite a turn of events when all of a sudden it became like, I was going to say low key, not low key, high key, an obsession. But actually, again, I feel like it feels quite my introduction to queer nightlife. It feels quite like nerdy almost, because actually it was when I was in uni in my undergrad. I had this incredible lecturer named Caroline Osella. Shout out Caroline Osella. You should all go look her up. Amazing anthropologist. So I had this incredible lecturer, and they were lecturing on kind of gender politics, and a lot of the examples and like ethnographic examples they would pull were from queer nightlife. I think it was worlds that they were very much actively involved in. And so they they told me to go to Chaos. So basically my introduction to partying was because my lecturer told me to go. So I was like, diligent student. Yeah, I was like, yes, I need to do my homework. So I went to Chaos back when it was at Electroworks, and it was incredible. And then from that, again, I started just like exploring other different scenes. I remember going one night quite randomly. I didn't know what the venue was at that point, but it turned out to be VFD's, which I know you've done a night there. And I remember walking in, and there was just like people dancing, and then all of a sudden somebody like parted the dance floor in two, and then these two people walked up to each other and started like making out, and all this black liquid started gushing out. Anyways, all that stuff just really hooked me, like the sensorial experience, the performance of it all, the like flamboyance. And from that point on, I started going out like so much, but often like on my own. Like sometimes I'd go to like 4 different nights in one night, just like hopping, because I was like very just thirsty to experience different worlds, different scenes. I found it really exciting, again, in a way that before it just hadn't really interested me. And after that, I actually started working with a collective called Contemporary, CUNT. So again, they don't no longer really do work, but at the time they were running, so this was a good couple years ago, maybe like 8-ish years ago, they were running performance art club nights at Bethnal Green Working Men's Club. And also with each club night, they would run a conference at Queen Mary with some of the performers and artists from the club night. So it was this kind of nice symbiotic relationship between like partying and discourse. So they would have people do like performative lectures in the conference and then do their performance at the club night. So I'd say those were definitely my entrance points. It was very much like, yeah, queer club nights with a lot of performance. I was very much excited by that world and kind of that scene. And then I ended up working in performance art, because I was like, ooh, that's what I'm excited by. That's what's drawing me to these spaces. And actually, the more I went into the performance art kind of gallery exhibition spaces, I was like, no, it's the club. I miss the club. So I did a whole backwards turn and went back to that. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Like, I mean, you know, I'm no scholar of like performance art, but I think like, you know, the rave or the dancing kind of embody a good balance of kind of like something which is slightly, you know, is performative and maybe slightly more scripted, but is also chaotic and hectic enough for kind of possibilities that maybe not even the performance artist, you know, would have expected. Fab. I mean, yeah. Last year you created and distributed a survey that invited UK-based queer nightlife workers to share their experiences of working in the nightlife sector. And it's important to note that the umbrella term of nightlife workers refers not just to DJs and performers, but also technicians, security, freelancers, cleaners, managers, welfare staff, artists, store staff and bar staff, and anyone else working in nightclubs, bars, or music venues or other cultural spaces. Yeah, I suppose what drew you towards this line of research? I'm aware you've said that kind of, you know, you were sort of I suppose you were going to conferences and studying aspects of rave culture, but, you know, what kind of drew you towards thinking about the kind of labour conditions and the capital relation within the clubbing sphere?
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely came from my own experience working in clubs. I think, again, earlier on in my career, I was doing like the programming at a queer club and just seeing the kind of just real disconnect between the stories that we were telling ourselves about queer clubbing and the kind of realities on the ground about what it was actually like to work in these venues. And so the venue that I worked at previously was also a theater. So I also had like a very direct comparison between kind of comparable industries. And I was noticing, I'm not saying that like theater is perfect or anything, but I was noticing there was a little bit more like union representation, or there were standard rates of pay. And then I was coming back to nightlife. And again, also from my experience working in performance art, coming back to nightlife, which was just like the Wild West in terms of like the flow of money, again, even just working conditions, like late hours, going home without public transport, not having your like cab fare covered. So it was just, noticing this what felt like at the time a really big gap between the stories we were telling ourselves about clubbing, queer clubbing being liberatory and utopic and, incredible and amazing, all of things which it is, but actually for the people who were sustaining these dance floors, it was just far less so. There's Ed Gillette in his book Party Lines. I remember there's one line where he's like, what good is a utopian dance floor if those who sustain it are exploited? And so it's kind of like, whose labor is this utopia actually riding on, and why don't they have a say? So I think at that point my focus started to be a bit more about not just like what kind of spaces we're creating in nightlife, but also how we're creating them, like how can we take some of this beautiful fervence from the dance floor and apply it to our actually like our organizing practices or our working practices or our working cultures. So that's kind of, it definitely came from working in nightlife and being like, ooh, this is rough, something needs to change here for like a lot of people. And so I was working around that. I was interested in that, and how I got to doing this survey for queer nightlife workers was just basically because there was very little data specifically about queer nightlife workers, very little information beyond the anecdotes, that kind of the truths that we all know on the ground and the stories that are being shared between each other. But actually I got to a point where I felt like it was really important to get this stuff down on paper, even if it is people's like anecdotes, to actually record it, because that makes it much easier to make a case for why things need to change, and to help people share their experiences and kind of move towards, I guess, different models or doing things differently. But also I found generally when I've spoken to nightlife workers, people are just relieved to have someone feel like they're being listened to, like I think when you're in a tough working environment, it can feel like you're screaming into the void. So just having one place for a lot of people's stories to come together, to start to see different patterns that might emerge. And there were definitely a lot of things, as I've been running this survey to capture people's stories, there were definitely a lot of things that were expected from my own experiences, but also a lot of stuff that was like quite unexpected, that was like new for me, that I hadn't really thought about or experienced because I hadn't occupied those roles in those spaces before. So I was always hesitant, I think. Again, I have about like surveys, they feel really stark and bland sometimes, but again, just simply because these stories weren't written down, they were not recorded, there was no data on like the experiences of queer nightlife workers, that I felt like it was important just to make a start basically on gathering those.
What kind of themes, what kind of recurring themes, emerged through that research and those conversations with nightlife workers? I think, what kinds of things didn't surprise you, and then what you mentioned that there were some aspects that did surprise you. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there were two things that really stood out as I started to like listen to people's responses and stories. I think one big thing that really jumped out at me was the experiences of welfare workers in nightlife, and how harsh those working conditions can be. And I think it says a lot that particularly our care workers, our care stewards, of nightlife are being so harshly exploited. And I think that's really tough and sad. And a lot of people, they're really like front line workers dealing with conflict on the dance floor, dealing with like substance issues, trying to be between kind of security, which can often reproduce harm, and venues and audiences. So our welfare workers hold a lot and I think they're doing incredible, really pioneering work. especially navigating kind of like drug licensing and I'm thinking of like groups like Safe Only trying to implement harm reduction practices in, clubs that often adopt like zero tolerance approaches. So I think they're doing really amazing work, but a lot of the experiences of welfare workers really stood out, particularly for that reason, because I was like, these people are pushing the care in our clubs and are just kind of being profoundly uncared for themselves. And that seemed to reflect in a lot of what people were saying, where they're like, go in, kind of hold so much in a space and then kind of just go home on their own without even thinking of any kind of catching of what experiences they might have gone through, which can be really, again, intense. Like clubbing is a really intense, high pressure environment. So I think, looking at the experiences of welfare workers, and particularly, I've had conversations with people who've been in queer nightlife much longer than me, and they've sort of said, oh, it's interesting. One person I remember telling me how it's interesting that these welfare workers, they were like, a few years ago, we were just all doing this voluntarily as like mates, on the night, while also maybe some of them would be like a bit fucked up, but then also, oh, this person needs help, let's get some water. So that was like happening quite organically in like a voluntary way. But nightlife, queer nightlife, has been professionalized. It's been industrialized. So all of a sudden, I would say since the pandemic, this idea of a welfare role is like new. And so I think that's why, it's almost like people haven't recognized yet that is a professional role in nightlife worthy of protections like many other roles need. So I think that's why it's in this in-between stage where it's all of a sudden been professionalized, but none of the conditions to actually support these roles in terms of having them flourish are there yet. I think that was one thing that really, stood out to me for sure. Yeah.
Sick. Thank you. No, that's really, really, really eye-opening. And you mentioned, working in a venue that had a theatre, but also a kind of a nightlife, a clubbing space. And you talked about, in theatre there were kind of, there was greater unionisation. In terms of, for nightlife workers currently, I'm aware that Unite has a sort of I don't know if you call it a branch or a shop for nightlife workers, and then there's also is CYBERTISA a union for sex workers as well? Yeah. Are there any other kinds of unions or sort of organisational bodies kind of pushing for nightlife workers' rights at the moment?
Yeah, excellent question. I think as far as I know, I know a few years ago I had joined UVW, United Voices of the World, and they had kind of like a music and nightlife-ish branch at the time in their cultural sector branch. It was very small at the time when I was there, and there weren't that many nightlife workers in it yet, but I know that they were definitely like open to that. And then the other one that is Equity. So Equity is a performers union, but they, particularly Nick Keegan, have done a lot of organizing work specifically around drag artists. So they have like a whole drag artist branch, which is incredible. And so when I found out about it, so I think I initially got in touch with Nick again because of this survey. So a lot of people were interested in unions, organization, because again, that data is interesting to people. It's not been recorded yet. So I first was in touch with Nick over that, and Nick was able to distribute the survey to all of these drag artists. But they've been doing incredible organizing, especially around Palestine stuff. A few of them involved in Equity. I think we're involved in the LAD fund, so it was like a strike fundraiser for people to be able to withdraw their work and get their fees recouped. They've also, I know Equity's drag branch has also been really involved in the Save the Bethnal Green Working Men's Club campaign. So again, showing the strength of that union in broader fights for against venue closures. So yeah, I feel really inspired by the drag artist branch at Equity at the moment, and what I'm hoping is that we can learn from groups like that and start to extend this to the wider nightlife sphere. I think there's also, I think it was BEC2, which is like for technicians, I think. But yeah, as far as I know, there isn't like a nightlife union that brings together all these different roles in one place, which I'm quite interested in that. I'm quite interested in what that would mean, because again, something that has come up a lot in my conversation with workers is the fragmentation of different roles. So like, again, you mentioned earlier, when we talk about nightlife workers, we're not just talking about DJs. And I think that's changing, I think, recently, but kind of, a lot of the focus around change in nightlife has been centered on DJs. And I think there can be a lot of power in that, like with labor withdrawals. I think as the most visible roles in nightlife, I think that can be incredibly powerful. But sometimes you have to wonder who's getting left by the wayside if we focus just on these very hyper visible roles. So yeah, that's what I know of about nightlife, but I'm hoping to find more people or more nightlife workers organizing. I know there's also been like burgeoning welfare unions, but I think people have found it hard to get off the ground. So yeah, I know there's lots of conversations, things happening, percolating. But yeah, as far as I know, no nightlife union, but I would love to be proven wrong.
Thanks a lot. No, I think, it's really, around probably around COVID time, that was a really big push within the industry for kind of achieving greater levels of visibility and diversity on lineups. And I think that brought a really interesting dynamic into the space, because it definitely showed how, your average punter, your average party goer really doesn't recognize the amount of workers within that space. They saw the DJ, they see the door person, but actually particularly in these more kind of these big clubs, big clubs with kind of over over 500 to 1,000 people. There's a lot of people behind the scenes who are producing and reproducing the space. So when thinking about how the reality of working conditions for nightlife workers, what they're like in 2025, it would be helpful in understanding a bit about how we got to this place, because in 1948 onwards, the Caribbean community in the UK were being discriminated against and terrorised by the British state and its police force. They were forcibly shutting down community gatherings and were brutalising participants. And these parties were usually held in homes or community centres, because black and brown people weren't allowed in the established public socialising spaces inhabited by white people. And then we move into the late 80s, and Margaret Thatcher and her government are shutting down unlicensed acid house raves, largely happening in fields and disused warehouses around the country. And then 1994, you have the infamous Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which looked to, quote, shut down events that are playing music that is wholly or predominantly characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats, which I think is one of the first written expressions of what acid house rave is, which is just so bizarre, so absurd, hearing it put like that. But how did this shift occur from state criminalization of parties and their participants to now, where the UK nightlife scene is a booming industry and it's backed by the UK government? Where did that shift occur, and how did it occur?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's definitely something I've been trying to learn more about. As you said, how did we get here? Because how did we get to this point? Because again, nightlife is actually only, from what I can understand, is only actually very recently professionalized, only very recently industrialized. And I think, that kind of history of criminalization, I would say, again, from what I've looked into and people I've spoken to, in the kind of late 80s and 90s, as it was increasingly clamped down, especially with the rise of rave culture, that criminalization sort of pushed a lot of these ravers, partiers into venues, and sort of moved it out from the open fields into commercial venues. And in that time also, there was a big push for kind of this idea of a creative Britain as kind of a national image, so really owning their creativity. That paired with the rise of the nighttime economy, which is looking at the night as another avenue for market spaces, another way to make money, another way to sell things, another way to increase consumption at night, so all of a sudden it becomes 24 hours. It's not just a daytime thing. And obviously nightlife were activities that were already happening, but But something there's this researcher named Deborah Talbot who has done like ethnographic research on the nighttime economy and specifically looks at it as in the context of institutional racism. So it's kind of looking at how things like alcohol licensing or different policies have been used kind of selectively to criminalize some people, but then also funnel other groups into more commercial avenues. So I'm thinking of like the now defunct Form 696, which was used to criminalize particularly like black music events. So it was a risk assessment used by the Metropolitan Police. I think they stopped using it in 2017 after a lot of campaigning around it. But it was basically a risk assessment that would ask kind of music event organizers what the demographic of the audience would be, what kind of music you would play. And it was accused of shutting down, black events, like primarily. So I think even as it's been commercialized, there's still a lot of policing going on for non-commercial events. I'm thinking of a couple weeks ago there was the This Is My Culture rave. I don't know if you know it. So it's like an annual queer rave in Hampstead Heath in honor of George Michael on like the gay cruising grounds in Hampstead Heath. And like the police showed up there so soon and like cut through the dance floor, like brought their bin bags as if to like clean up the event. And it was such a wholesome event. They like have speeches. It's like almost more like picnic vibes, And I just think it's interesting that as nightlife develops into this huge commercial industries with these like super club, mega clubs, like Drum Sheds, RIP IKEA, like all these venues. Yeah, exactly. That actually a lot of parties are still getting shut down, are still getting criminalized. And yeah, so I think that still is happening. And I think often it's the ones that are not commercial, ones that are happening in public space, like ones that people are very much pressured if you want to run events towards doing them in licensed venues because I think, policing is continuing of these events, especially when they're like a reclamation of public space in, you should be able to gather in Hampstead Heath. It's a very safe event, and the fact that was like the police came so soon to basically shut it down and the party had to split and then move to like Hackney Wick because it couldn't continue there with all the policing, is just kind of so mad. Like that you can't put up a little sound, like that you're not near any neighbors, you're not near anybody that you could disturb. But I think it's this inherent perspective on partying as like bad, as like unsafe, as like dirty. And I think actually these stories, this moralism around nightlife is what's dropped into policy making today, about like, oh, this kind of nightlife is safe, so we have to regulate it and commercialize it and sanitize it, and that's the one that can continue to flourish, when that's not the case. That's not true. One isn't inherently safer than the other or inherently dangerous. But yeah, I think that was a very roundabout way of how we got here. But the truth is, I don't know. I'm trying to find out.
No, it's super interesting. I think, in your writing, you quote Caspar Melville, who wrote It's a London Thing, who talks about it being, is it historical racialized amnesia? Really thinking about, in narratives of, particularly of like 80s and 90s rave, these narratives that are utilized in our media to kind of really push, these ideas of entrepreneurialism and independent free spirit, which are, these kind of very highly like neoliberal kind of ideas and ideologies. Where are the narratives of people, friends just gathering, outside of spaces that were defined by, by capital. I kind of want to move on to that, into that a little bit more to talk about sort of how queers have tended to have to gather in market spaces. You've written that, more than any other marginalised group, queer people have, they tend to gather in market spaces, these institutions that are mediated through the capital relation, centering around financial development and continual growth. And you said that this is because non-market spaces that have been central to other political struggles say, churches, or I don't know, particularly like maybe like the nuclear family, I'm not sure, or I don't know if you'd include unions in that, whether, you know, what history of queers and unions has been, you know, in terms of safety levels, but these sites haven't been as available to queers as spaces for movement building. And you say, I'm going to quote you say, this market dependence has always been double-edged. While it enabled gathering and survival, it also tethered queer culture to consumerism. As nightlife became a commercial industry, queerness itself became defined and confined by market logics. Queer emerged as a marketable identity. As a result, community spaces forged in commercial spaces came to define queer labour. If our de facto community spaces are also businesses, then we will urgently need alternative models. You've talked a little bit about the party, sort of really special gathering that you run called Lilith. And over the last couple of years, you've hosted the party in various different non-commercial spaces, which I think, as somebody who, you know, runs my own parties when I can, like, recognise how hard that can be, and how many hoops you often have to jump through. Can you tell us about why you chose those spaces and what kind of effect it's had on shaping the character of the party or the gathering?
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, our night Lilith, again, I run it with Esme, so XS, and a very broad group of people, because again, as you know, putting on a night is a lot of work. So we have so many people come together to make Lilith happen, which is always like incredibly beautiful. And so Esme and I started running Lilith, in kind of clubs, some of our like favorite clubs in London, so like Spanners, Avalon, and those were excellent. I love both of those venues really dearly. But we just wanted to get weirder, weirder and wobblier, and just like take it in different directions. And we felt a little bit constrained by the club, and, you know, like needing to get everyone out at a certain time. And so we decided, I think maybe a year or two ago, basically just as an experiment, to be like, okay, what if we don't do these in commercial club spaces? What's going to happen? So we did our first one in Esme's house. Thank you, Esme and housemates. And like, again, that one was incredible. It was like, one of my friends, Jay, is one of the most talented like lighting artists, and Jay and Hugh do all this decor, and they basically covered like the entire house. Were you there? Do you remember? It was like it was basically the plastic sheeting that I don't know if I should give Jay's secrets away, but I'm gonna do it. It was basically the plastic sheeting that you use, like dust sheet when you paint. But they covered the entire, lined the entire inside of the house with this dust sheeting, and put like sound reactive lighting behind the dust sheeting, and then we filled it with smoke. So it created this like you couldn't tell where the corners are, and I hate corners in clubs. That's one of my least favorite things. So like they were like, you just couldn't really like tell where it was. Anyways, it just created this incredible ethereal experience that paired with, we had Holobiont, who made this like edible swamp landscape across the kitchen, which was like so beautiful and like horrific. And it was like, had like asparagus as trees, and the mud I think was made out of Oreo, and people were just like eating it. And so one big thing was that we really wanted food involved. We wanted to like play with food. We wanted food to be like part of the night, and that can be kind of tricky in clubs sometimes. And we also wanted multiple spaces, so there was this like sense of journey. So hence the house. And we wanted like a chill out space again, and like a lot of clubs in the London at the moment don't have chill out rooms. They don't really have places to sit apart from the smoking area. Yeah, so we felt very limited, and we decided to move it out. And honestly, that weirdly we never expected, but moving it out of clubs, like we sold out that first event, and every event since we've sold out, which we weren't expecting at all. But I think the reason why I'm sharing that is I think it shows people actually have a real appetite for something else, something a little bit more experiential. So yeah, we made a very intentional choice, take it out of commercial clubs. We did the first one in Esme's house. The second one we did at the Rising Sun, which is like a housing co-op in an old pub in South London. And then the last one we did at an outdoor spot in Enfield. That was the jelly wrestling one, which I'm going to keep talking about because I loved the jelly wrestling. It worked so well. And that has, I think taking it out of clubs has completely transformed the event. It's like, again, it's become so just silly and out there. And what I've noticed happening the more we run events is the more people are like approaching us being like, I really want to try this thing out. Can I do it at Lilith? You know, like I really want, whether it's like a performance or like making a sculpture, I just like that kind of experimentation. It's almost like, yeah, people, it's like catching on, and people who have been to the night before, for the next one, they'll come back and have made something for it. And that just feels so beautiful, because running it, just me and Esme for the first few, was a lot, you know, and it's nice that it's become this space that anyone just feels like they can test something out, you know, and that, yeah, that's felt really, really beautiful. So yeah, it's definitely been a good shift. It's a hell of a lot of work, and doesn't make any money. And, so we've just kind of totally sidestepped the, kind of trying to make it a thing and just sort of focusing on having a really good time and trying not to be totally out of pocket every event. But another thing we do with Lilith is the budget's totally transparent with anybody who works the event. So like any DJs, anyone who helps on the door or the bar, we share it out to everybody. So it's just completely transparent. So it's not like everybody knows where it's where it's going and what it's going to. And yeah, running events can be quite expensive, but yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Our budget is actually, it's also totally open to anyone who just comes to the party. People just need to ask, basically. It's there for whoever wants to see it and who's interested in it. But yeah, I think taking it out of clubs has been such a nourishing move for all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, it really hits home, you know. I don't every week want to just be like dancing in a sweaty black box with no character, and I feel like the Lilith gatherings that I've been to feels a little bit like, do you ever do like show and tell at school, where, you know, and it just feels like each person's coming and being like, oh, this is what I can do, and you engage with it, and it feels super, super special. And I think that really encourages me as well. I think it can be, when you sort of, particularly in a culture that kind of, sells kind of each individual rave as a product that people need to buy into. I think as a promoter, you can sometimes take that on. As you've talked about, you're working with, a pot of money, and you're trying to pay everyone fairly. And so you can kind of, feel like, I feel like I can often kind of hold things quite tightly and feel quite controlling over it, because it's like, oh my gosh, so much stuff could go wrong, and I don't want to lose 500 quid, I can't afford to lose that. So, and that's just, for a small rave. So no, I think it's been really encouraging. I found it really encouraging coming to the Lilith and kind of really, witnessing a kind of a really cool, more, I think, equitable and creative and dynamic way of doing partying. I want to talk, quite a bit about sort of, forms of soft power and also, pink washing and glitter washing within the scene, and how queerness and identity pride, are utilized in these, in these practices of pink washing and glitter washing, and maybe kind of just if you could explain what pink washing is, but also, what, in thinking about, how these sort of superficial notions of community, and, moments of coming together are kind of, are commodified by the clubbing industry. What would you kind of encourage your average sort of party goer to kind of consider before kind of buying into this? I think, we can be quite, what am I trying to say? I think that one thing I've really enjoyed from your writing is kind of you spell out a lot of the feelings that I feel but aren't able to articulate. And I think that, yes, actually, you know what? I've said it. I don't even know if there's a question there, but can you just speak to that, and can you speak to, ideas around sort of pink washing? And I would love you to talk about, how the Israeli state, pink washes raving to cover up their, genocidal crimes. And thinking about how we might sort of, in our communities, naturalize rave as inherently progressive. How do states, utilize queerness, utilize rave, utilize identity pride to kind of validate or sort of naturalize their violence against indigenous people, racialized bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot in there. No, not at all. A lot of really rich and incredible stuff. But yeah, I think especially as queer partiers, as queer people, whatever that might mean, we need to be very, very aware of pinkwashing. And so yeah, it's the use of kind of queerness, queer identity, queer practices to mask, as you mentioned, more violent habits. And again, it comes back to this assumption of inherent progressiveness, which I think is often attached to queerness by states like the Israeli state, like in terms of its strategic use of pinkwashing, to present itself as a more progressive nation in that area, kind of, and it also flattens everybody else's cultures and identities in doing so. So it's, strategic use of queerness is like a progressive value. And I think the same thing happens with club culture and rave. In some circles, it's seen as inherently progressive, inherently good. And I think there's a lot of danger in assuming anything is inherently anything, because you can have, again, very violent party practices. They're not inherently doing anything. So we have to actually look at not just what they mean and the stories we're telling ourselves or each other about them, but actually what their actual impact on the ground is. So yeah, that's again why a lot of my focus has been less about, I'm interested in the myths and narratives around nightlife because of what they do, what they mask, but also about focusing on the practices, like the workers, the worker stories and what those kind of reveal. But yeah, so it is interesting. I think we wouldn't always automatically think of queerness or partying as a tool, as a nationalist tool, but I think very much there's moments of strategic use, kind of appropriation. I don't know if appropriation is the right word, but use. And I think it goes back to also, I'll leave it there. There's a lot there.
No, thanks. And I mean, I think, this brings me on to kind of wanting to talk about cultural boycotts for Palestine that, are really, coming into sort of the collective consciousness quite a bit. They've been it's been something on everyone's lips and minds, particularly, throughout this year. We've seen a real shift over the last couple of years of party organisers focusing less on symbolic representations of clubbing and focusing more on how we can create material change in our communities and workplaces. And this has come through the kind of calls for workers, cultural workers and artists striking institutions that are tied to Israeli occupation and genocide against Palestinians. So for anyone listening who hasn't heard or isn't familiar of the kinds of things that are going on in the nightlife scene at the moment, sort of a brief summary of the current state of play. So institutions like Boiler Room and UK festivals such as Field Day, Cross the Tracks, Mighty Hoopla, and internationally Sona Festival, amongst others. All of these are owned by Superstruct Entertainment, whose parent company is the private equity firm KKR. And KKR invests in Israeli data surveillance centres. It finances illegal Israeli settlements in occupied territories. And it commits widespread environmental devastation, which is largely affecting First Nations communities in Canada. And I think my kind of earliest memory of where these sort of cultural boycotts, this kind of wave of cultural boycotts started was, I think there was an activist group who stood outside a Boiler Room event in a town in Canada and was calling for people, was kind of disseminating information and leaflets about Boiler Room's connection to KKR and KKR's criminal practices. So these boycotts have raised more serious and deepening conversations around how our established musical and cultural institutions are funded by and really intimately tied to private equity and consequently colonial capitalist exploitation. my question is, when operating within a economic system where blood-soaked money is everywhere, and taking into account that, as individuals, we are much weaker than when we take action together. What actions and tactics have collectively taken by cultural workers have had the most impact?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question, and I think the Palestine solidarity movement has rocked the foundations of most of our world, but given that we're talking about nightlife, around the nightlife industry in a way that felt very hard to imagine when I was working in it a few years ago, where, it was very, very hard to organize nightlife workers, very, very hard. Despite all this, again, dreaminess about the collectivism of the dance floor, actually, it was very fragmented world. People were in their own scenes, workers just stayed in their own lanes. Things were very transient. It was just very hard to have any kind of sustained organizing. Whereas in the past 2 years, it's the ferocity and velocity of collective organizing has been like nothing I've ever seen, which is really incredible. And I think, again, I'll just talk about my dear friend Esme, along with a wider group of DJs and artists from Sisu Crew, sort of led a labor withdrawal and boycott of Field Day, which is a major festival. And on that lineup, Field Day, a lot of these, like Sisu was probably amongst the smaller artists on that lineup, but they were very, very strategic in terms of how they leveraged their position, because I think, from having had conversations with them, they knew that if they pulled out instantly as kind of the smallest artist, no one would take any notice. They'd just be replaced immediately. But they started with an open letter. They started with attempting to have conversations with Field Day. And only when that started to garner attention, support, did, really at the last minute, did they decide to withdraw. So that was kind of always on the cards, but they timed it really well. And so when they withdrew, they ended up taking over half the lineup with them, which is insane. And I think that's just an example of like a really, really like successful bit of organizing. And so I've been, watching that with admiration kind of from the sidelines. And I think the Palestine solidarity movement has, as you said, exposed how deep private equity runs in our community spaces, in our underground spaces. I mean, that doesn't even really mean anything anymore, in a way that I think people just were not aware of or were not interested in thinking about. So I'm hoping a lot of this movement people are much more discerning, I think, right now in terms of where they perform, where they buy tickets. People are way, way more discerning than they were. And I think aware of the kind of lack of transparency around a lot of these organizations that are sort of, considered to be pivotal or central to our nightlife scenes. And I think that's very exciting to think about how all of these bits are kind of, crumbling because people are recognizing their own power as workers, as nightlife workers, as artists, to be able to withdraw collectively. But again, I think the key is really in that collectively. I think one person withdrawing, and I remember seeing this in the, shortly after October 7th, there was a boycott call for Hor Berlin for censoring some Palestinian symbols on their live stream. And I remember in those early days, some people started to withdraw, but some people were keeping their sets up. And again, that fragmentation, it ended up getting a lot of, weight and power behind it. But in those early days, I know that people withdrawing, it's very lonely, because like you withdraw on your own and then you kind of wonder, did it make an impact? Is there an impact? So trying to get people to do this with you, to do it kind of, en masse is, I think, really, really key. And I think people are much more, aware of the value of working together and, again, supporting each other through withdrawing, because it's a precarious position to put if you're an artist and you rely on that kind of visibility, but being able to do it together and kind of like hold each other in that withdrawal and being like, we can do this, and actually all together angle ourselves towards something that isn't funding the war machine, is really powerful.
I think just, to go back a bit, you make a really good point, I think, about what Sisu Crew did, because it's like, the importance of strikes is you're you're kind of trying to raise consciousness of the general population, and you're trying to educate people about the conditions which are deeply unjust and which are, very exploitative. So I think, that was, a really, really kind of well thought through and intentioned move from CCR, recognizing what position they were in and how they could kind of garner more support, more awareness through that. And yeah, I mean, it can feel like a lot of, grassroots artists, often working class artists of colour in precarious working conditions, have been striking, pulling out of events and withholding their labour. And whilst this has been going on, we've seen lots of collectives, promoters and artists in much more comfortable financial positions who can afford to strike, releasing these, at best, non-committal public statements, sort of couched in corporate apology speech, about why they're not going to boycott these festivals that are linked to Israeli occupation. And, whilst we should be kind of focusing on these kinds of these artists and these promoters who are much more kind of intertwined and how are in positions where they can utilize that power. I've been noticing sort of increasingly more conflicts and disagreements emerge within the community of pro strikers, particularly about the specificities of striking strategy, what demands should be made and how they should be made, and just the general conditions in which strikes are carried out. Meanwhile, both parties have the same goal of not supplying their labour to institutions with material ties to Israel. And I'm just wondering, kind of, as we see this, in the long term, as we see this as kind of a long-term struggle, what you feel the most productive way to address these disagreements is within our community spaces, because social media call-outs don't feel particularly useful or productive. I'm also aware that you recently facilitated an event with Nightlife Solidarity Network. I wasn't able to go to it, but I really wanted to. And I was just wondering if that ties into my question, if you could speak more about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I think it is interesting because nightlife recently, again, as it's kind of professionalized, as it's industrialized, as all of a sudden more and more people are like, oh, I can be a professional full-time jet-setting DJ, has also become increasingly wedded to social media, and kind of all of the discourse and ways of interacting that come with that, I think, have very much become almost synonymous with nightlife. So I'm referring specifically to the infighting, which I think we know which post we're talking about. So yeah, I think that's become very social media has a lot of value, but it's also can be very, very combative and very not conducive to discussion and conversation. And I think people will always disagree on strategy, and people are coming from all sorts of different positions and experience levels and are leveraging their own power, right? Weighing up what power they have in every situation to kind of use that. So I think, I am no expert in organizing. I'm new to all of this world and I'm learning a lot, but I definitely, much like with Lilith, much like with my own party practices, I'm trying as much as possible to take them offline, to not do this stuff online. Social media is a tool and you can use it really strategically. I think Sisu used it at the right moment to leverage their position to make the biggest impact that they could. But I don't think you have to just be really, on it with when you're using it and why. And I think over the past few years, all of nightlife has just existed on Instagram. It's just existed online. So people are so used to using it and relying on it. And I'm definitely trying, at least, just personally trying to take these things offline a little bit more. And that is very much where the Nightlife Solidarity Network emerged from. It was sort of after this, all of these boycott movements, but also after the field day boycott, Esme and I kind of came together and we're like, okay, this is an incredible moment where people are recognizing their power as workers, they're withdrawing, they're striking, they're making an impact. But how do we make sure this something can last beyond this moment? How do we sustain this energy, this power? So the Nightlife Solidarity Network is just, basically that. It's about organizing within the nightlife sector by and for nightlife workers. So we had our first session at Ormside Projects in South London that was focused on organizing for Palestine. So we had a couple different workshops, shared different tools and tactics. And again, it's about getting people offline, off Instagram, in person in a physical space together to actually talk about these things. And again, nightlife is very fragmented. There aren't that many spaces at the moment for those kinds of discussions. And so we're hoping to continue running these sessions like semi-regularly, and maybe have different areas of focus depending on what people want to talk about. So we're planning another one focused on Palestine in September, but there might be others more focused on kind of like unionizing in nightlife and other things like that. But yeah, it's definitely been about taking things offline, getting people in a physical space together and actually chatting and sharing information and tactics so that we don't have to call each other out on social media, because I don't think that's helpful. I don't.
Obviously, I've got very familiar to reading your writing, but I was just wondering if, you'd be willing to actually read out this. It's just a little quote, an excerpt from, I think it's from your essay, Rave Nationalism. Would you be happy to do that? Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll read it out. Ooh, shy. There's a reason why I'm a writer and not a public speaker. But yeah, I'll read it out. So, the more we refuse, the more we pull our labor from festivals and platforms complicit in genocide, the more energy we have to build alternatives that are by us and for us. Sarah Ahmed reminds us, those who arrive in an academy that was not shaped by or for us bring knowledge as well as worlds that otherwise would not be here. But what happens when our presence is stripped of that world-making quality? When we're not invited to shape the space, only to decorate it? When our names appear on flyers but our voices are absent? When we haunt the scene as ghosts on a lineup, strategically placed yet silent? Maybe we can own being those ghosts, the ones that haunt the system, the ones that won't sit still in the margins. Let's leap off the stage, off the booth, off the speaker stacks. Boo bitch, like Ahmed said, will be the broken record. If they keep remixing our labor for clout and coin, we'll keep refusing their carrots. We'll be the spanner in the smooth-running nightlife industrial complex. We'll be the ones who interrupt the vibe with a memory, a truth, a question. We'll be difficult, deliberately so, a glitch in the system they thought they'd repackaged already.
Thanks very much. Andy, how long have we got? How long have we been running for? 3 more minutes. Oh, gosh. Okay. Oh, flipping heck. Oh, my goodness. I knew we weren't going to get through everything. Okay, I might just ask a couple more things. I think, in thinking about, the importance of blueprints within, the QT BIPOC scene of community organizing within clubbing spaces. You kind of blew my mind when you wrote about systematic. And I would just love you to kind of talk about systematic, because it just, when you read something or find out about something and it really affirms your experience, it kind of, I thought, no, actually, this stuff has always been going on. And yeah, sorry. Yeah. I'm glad how excited it makes you.
Yeah, systematic is incredible. I'm so glad you brought that up. And honestly, every time anyone has either read the piece of writing as systematic or I tell them about it, everyone just stops for a minute. So yeah, for context, for anyone who's listening, Systematic is a Black lesbian sound system. It was founded in Brixton in 1985, and they were running for a few years in the South London Women's Centre, so a very politicized community center throughout the 80s. They shut when that community center lost funding sometime either in the maybe early 90s, late 80s, and then recently kind of revived and came back in collaboration with newer collectives like Night Dykes, who sort of brought them back, and they started running events together as Systematic. But one of the most incredible things about Systematic is that when they were throwing their raves, literally from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. in the 80s, they had a creche so that mothers could come to the party and drop off their babies in a soundproof room with qualified creche workers. And it just, again, every time I tell people about that, they're just minds are blown, because it just really is clubbing as a community space, and it almost puts into perspective how far we've strayed from that almost, and how much we can really learn from groups like Systematic. I had the privilege of speaking and interviewing one of the founders, Yvonne Taylor, and there was just so much to learn from what they were doing then. And I think the more that I speak to and learn from older queer ravers, the more I'm like, wow, they were partying so hard and so much better than us, and in so much more of an we have all this narrative and discourse about inclusion and access, and they were doing it already, actually. And again, the interesting thing is a lot of them were doing it not in commercial club venues, which again, I think definitely inspired where we went with Lilith, just in terms of being like, okay, what becomes possible when you take it out of these spaces? What kind of people can you actually bring in? So yeah, Systematic is incredible. I'm very, very deeply inspired by their work. And yeah, I think they were doing something incredible. They would run, also solidarity fundraisers. They would have food at all of their parties. Again, a big inspiration for Lilith. Like, we need to eat when we rave. I get hungry. So they're just incredible. And so yeah, starting to look back again, not even to the very far past, to the pretty recent past, to be honest, has been very, very moving and inspiring for me in terms of thinking about a way out of our current predicament, in terms of thinking about all the issues we've discussed around private equity basically infiltrating our community club spaces, about exploitative working conditions. I'm kind of like, okay, what can we learn from this recent past? What can we learn from queer elders about the way they were raving, and what can we take from that and apply it to our current context? How can it kind of lead us towards the next step? So yeah, definitely look into Systematic. They're incredible.
Yeah, I think, the way in which the care work wasn't invisibilized, but it was made, it was central to the event, and everyone knew that it was central to the event, that it through the creche, the party happened because the care worker, the specialized care workers were, looking after the children. I think also, the importance of intergenerationality, which we don't have in our rave spaces as well. Yeah, I think I've got kind of one more thing that I would like to kind of talk about, and then we'll finish off. It's been such an enriching conversation, and I knew it would be, but no, thank you so much for just sort of, sharing your thoughts and your experiences, and reflections. But yeah, I think I want to kind of end by talking a little bit about sort of queer memory and archiving and queer futures, and how they all kind of link together. And the contemporary clubbing industry seems to be obsessed with newness and visibility, which leads a lot of promoters to feel like their night needs to stand out above all the others, within a really oversaturated attention economy. And this is often achieved through heavy social media use, like professional photography, 15-second reels of big DJ drops, and a style of branding that manufactures this feeling of FOMO. You can't miss this. We're sold this promise of innovation, that this rave will be different from all the others. And, this is a marketing model that more commercial promoters have perfected, but there is definitely a pressure for smaller, more DIY promoters who are running their nights on a shoestring budget to follow these marketing strategies, often in order to make sure they don't lose heaps of money. And in your recent writing, you've questioned how this capitalist short-termism, which promotes these individualistic self-making practices, has affected our collective memory as young queer clubbers, in particular leaving gaps in our queer histories and leading to the loss of our stories. We're disconnected from the knowledge of who and what came before us and why we're here. And you ask, without remembering our past, does it become more challenging for us as queers to imagine our futures? Could you talk a little bit more about this idea?
Yeah, for sure. Again, through my kind of obsession, as I spoke about, or my sudden obsession in nightlife, again, as an adult, it wasn't an early thing at all for me. I think as I got more and more embedded into nightlife and club culture and started going out, DJing, running my own stories, especially within queer nightlife, I think my interest in memory just came from a very, I guess, selfish place, trying to be who was doing this before? We're not the first ones to do this, right? Surely we can't be. And I wanted to understand, it came from a selfish space of wanting to understand what came before me, but also trying to look for my own personal future in nightlife. So again, I started partying as an adult, and I want to party until I'm old. So I wanted examples of people partying until they were old, and I wanted examples of people, you know, kind of moving through these scenes across different ages. And I think also, again, personally, as I've started to age, you know, you question in very young spaces, young scenes, like how long can I last here? What kind of spaces do I go to get this experience, this need fulfilled of being in a space with other people, of dancing? So it kind of came from that place of looking for stories to make me understand what my own route could be in this world. And yeah, I found some really beautiful stories like Systematic. I've also had I also interviewed someone named Catherine Griffiths that I published. Again, she is a DJ that was very active in the lesbian scene in London in the 80s and 90s, and speaking to older queer people, older queer ravers, specifically like dyke ravers, has just been so inspiring to me. And it's made me, for the first time, not like question being like, does this have a time limit for me? You know, at some point, am I going to have to stop? Am I going to have to grow up? God forbid. And I'm like, actually, no, I don't. This can go on for old age. So that has been so heartening for me. And Catherine Griffith specifically, again, does a lot of work around queer archiving and memory. Yeah, embodied archive. So it's from Catherine Griffiths that first introduced a lot of these ideas to me. And I remember her telling me about embodied archives. She was kind of saying, as queer people, often our stories are not in institutional archives. They're not remembered. You know, that's the classic when you look past in time and they're like, they were best friends. And you're like, were they? You know, these stories are kind of hidden. You sort of have to read between the lines when you go back in history to kind of uncover queer stories. So Catherine Griffiths was one of the first people to say me that, tell me a lot of our stories are in our bodies. You know, we remember them and we can tell each other these stories. And I think that, much like that ties into queer embodied archives, it ties into party archives. This is also an embodied experience that, much like queer stories are extremely ephemeral, hard to capture, ineffable. You know, they're slippery. We can't take them and put them in an archive quite neatly. It comes in the story. It comes through party flyers, you know, little bits of ephemera that kind of signal something was there, something was happening. So yeah, I think there's a lot, again, putting queerness side by side with like raving, there's a lot of resonances between them when we start to think about how we remember and how we archive. But I think it's such an important task to face this present moment, not only in nightlife, but I think in the queer community in general, particularly the trans community, you know, facing increasing pressures and transphobia from policymakers and politicians. I think actually capturing our stories and sharing our stories and being like, we were here then, we're here now, we're going to be there in the future, is such an important task for us to continue. So yeah, also finding our queer elder dykes. That's very important to do.
I think that's a great note to end on, finding our queer dyke elders. Thank you so much, Anjali. Really appreciate you speaking. Thanks to anyone who listened. You know, this will be up on the Cubitt Community Radio Mixcloud account for you to listen back to. At some point next month, I'll be airing an interview that I'm going to do with my really close friend Rachel, who, when I was a uni student, got me kind of involved in the kind of community radio station in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa. And I'm going to talk to Rachel about her experience as the long-term breakfast host and just a person around the station, around the community, doing really, really sick work, and the importance of physical radio community spaces, you know, in a time when a lot of community radio stations are online. You know, what does it mean to embody these spaces, be embodied in these spaces? Thanks a lot. Have a good night. Cheers. Should I press? I'll press the little Cubitt button. Do you want to press the Cubitt buttons? You press from 1 till 12, and you can, yeah. Go.
Cubitt Community Radio.